Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of the Chinese Civil War, 1927–1949. Now buckle up as we begin. In 1927, China stood at a crossroads of destiny. The fragile alliance between Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Kuomintang and Mao Zedong's Communist Party had crumbled into violent betrayal. On April 12, 1927, in the bustling commercial heart of Shanghai, Chiang launched a surprise purge that would ignite 2 decades of civil war. Communist organizers, labor leaders, and suspected sympathizers were hunted down in the streets. Machine gun fire echoed through the international settlement as Green Gang criminals, hired by the nationalists, executed hundreds in cold blood. This massacre, known as the White Terror, shattered any hope of peaceful coexistence between the two ideologies vying for China's soul. The survivors of Shanghai's bloodbath fled to the mountains of Jiangxi province, where Mao Zedong established the Chinese Soviet Republic in 1931. This rugged terrain became the crucible where communist ideology would be forged through guerrilla warfare tactics. Mao's strategy was revolutionary: win the hearts and minds of peasants through land redistribution, while conducting hit-and-run attacks against nationalist forces. The Red Army, initially a ragtag collection of farmers and workers, grew stronger with each successful raid. They captured weapons, recruited volunteers, and established base areas where communist rule took root. Chiang Kai-shek, meanwhile, consolidated his power in Nanjing, building a modern army with German advisors and advanced weaponry. The stage was set for a prolonged struggle between two vastly different visions of China's future: Chiang's authoritarian modernization versus Mao's peasant revolution. Chiang Kai-shek was determined to crush the communist stronghold before it could spread further. Beginning in 1930, he launched a series of massive encirclement campaigns against the Jiangxi Soviet, each more intense than the last. The nationalists deployed hundreds of thousands of troops, supported by aircraft and modern artillery, to surround and squeeze the communist base areas. During the first 4 campaigns, Mao's guerrilla tactics proved devastatingly effective. Red Army units would strike swiftly at isolated nationalist columns, then melt back into the mountains before reinforcements could arrive. Local peasants served as eyes and ears, providing intelligence about enemy movements while denying supplies to the invaders. However, by 1933, Chiang had learned from his failures. The 5th encirclement campaign employed a slow, methodical approach, building blockhouses and roads to systematically strangle the communist territory. German military advisors helped design a strategy that would ultimately succeed where brute force had failed. By October 1934, the noose had tightened around the Jiangxi Soviet. Chiang's 5th encirclement campaign, with its network of blockhouses and economic blockade, was succeeding where previous assaults had failed. Facing annihilation, communist leaders made a desperate decision that would become legendary: abandon their base and break out through enemy lines. On the night of October 16th, approximately 86,000 Red Army soldiers and 15,000 civilians began what history would remember as the Long March. Carrying their wounded, essential supplies, and dismantled printing presses, this massive column slipped past nationalist sentries and began an epic journey into the unknown. The breakout was successful, but the cost was immediate and severe. Within weeks of fighting through enemy lines and crossing treacherous rivers, communist forces had already suffered thousands of casualties. What lay ahead was a year-long odyssey across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. The Long March transformed into an epic of human endurance that would inspire generations. Pursuing nationalist forces and hostile warlords attacked the communist column at every opportunity, while nature itself seemed determined to halt their progress. The marchers crossed 24 rivers and 18 mountain ranges, including some of the highest peaks in China. At the Xiang River, fierce fighting reduced communist numbers from 86,000 to barely 30,000 survivors. Starvation became a constant companion as supplies dwindled and foraging provided meager sustenance. During this darkest period, Mao Zedong gradually assumed supreme leadership of the party and military, his strategic vision offering hope when all seemed lost. The march became a mobile university where communist ideology was refined and strengthened through shared suffering. Veterans would later describe how the experience forged an unbreakable bond between leaders and followers, creating the foundation for eventual victory. Every step forward was a testament to revolutionary determination. In January 1935, at the remote town of Zunyi in Guizhou province, communist leaders gathered for a conference that would change Chinese history. With their forces reduced to fewer than 20,000 survivors and facing continued military disasters, the party leadership engaged in heated debates about strategy and command. Mao Zedong emerged from this meeting as the paramount leader, his guerrilla warfare philosophy vindicated by events. The conference marked not just a change in leadership, but a fundamental shift in communist strategy and ideology. Under Mao's guidance, the remaining marchers continued their epic journey, now with clearer purpose and unified command. They crossed the treacherous grasslands of western China, where altitude sickness and marsh fever claimed more lives than bullets. Local Tibetan and Yi minority peoples, initially hostile, were won over through respectful treatment that contrasted sharply with previous Chinese armies. The march was becoming both a military maneuver and a political campaign to unite China's diverse peoples. After 370 days and 6,000 miles of marching, the survivors finally reached the communist base in northern Shanxi province in October 1935. Of the original 86,000 who began the journey, fewer than 8,000 completed the entire march, though others had joined along the way. What appeared to be a military disaster had transformed into a propaganda triumph and legend. The Long March established Mao as the undisputed leader of Chinese communism and created a core of hardened veterans whose loyalty was absolute. These survivors became the backbone of a reinvigorated movement that would eventually conquer all of China. The march also demonstrated communist determination to the Chinese people and the world, proving that this was not merely another warlord faction, but a movement with genuine revolutionary conviction. Stories of sacrifice and heroism during the march became powerful recruitment tools. In the caves of Yan'an, the new communist capital, Mao began formulating the strategies that would ultimately lead to victory. While Chinese fought Chinese, a greater threat was emerging from the east. Imperial Japan had already seized Manchuria in 1931, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo under the last Qing Emperor Puyi. Japanese military leaders, emboldened by their success and minimal international response, planned further expansion into China proper. On July 7, 1937, a minor skirmish at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing escalated into full-scale war as Japanese forces launched their invasion. This external aggression fundamentally changed the dynamics of the Chinese Civil War. Suddenly, both nationalists and communists faced a common enemy whose brutality and ambitions threatened China's very existence as an independent nation. Chiang Kai-shek found himself fighting a two-front war, while Mao saw an opportunity to position the communists as patriotic defenders of the motherland. The Japanese invasion would prove to be both a catastrophe for China and ultimately a crucial factor in communist victory. The Japanese war machine rolled across China with devastating efficiency, employing tactics of unprecedented brutality against military and civilian targets alike. The fall of Nanjing in December 1937 was followed by weeks of systematic massacre, rape, and looting that shocked the world. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians were murdered in what became known as the Rape of Nanjing. Japanese forces used biological weapons, burned villages, and implemented a three-alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all. This savage occupation created millions of refugees and devastated China's economy and infrastructure. However, Japanese brutality also unified Chinese resistance in ways that decades of political propaganda had failed to achieve. Peasants who had been indifferent to ideological conflicts now saw foreign invaders destroying their homes and families. This created unprecedented opportunities for both communist and nationalist organizers to recruit supporters and establish bases behind enemy lines. The War of National Survival had begun. Recognizing that survival required unity, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong agreed to a second united front against Japanese aggression in 1937. This alliance was born of necessity rather than trust, as both leaders harbored deep suspicions about their temporary partners' ultimate intentions. The Communists agreed to place their forces under nominal nationalist command while maintaining actual independence of action. This arrangement allowed both sides to fight the Japanese while positioning themselves for the inevitable resumption of civil war. Communist forces, reorganized as the 8th Route Army and new 4th Army, proved particularly effective at guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines. They established base areas in occupied territory, won peasant support through moderate land reforms, and constantly harassed Japanese supply lines. Meanwhile, nationalist forces bore the brunt of conventional warfare, fighting costly battles that gradually weakened Chiang's best units. The temporary alliance masked a continuing struggle for legitimacy and popular support. While maintaining their alliance publicly, both sides prepared for the post-war struggle that everyone knew was coming. The new 4th Army incident of January 1941 revealed the fragility of communist-nationalist cooperation. When communist forces in central China refused to withdraw to areas north of the Yangtze River as ordered, nationalist troops surrounded and attacked them. Thousands of communist soldiers were killed or captured in fighting that lasted several days. This betrayal, as the communists called it, effectively ended meaningful cooperation while maintaining the pretense of unity against Japan. Mao used the incident to portray Chiang as more interested in fighting communists than Japanese invaders. From their base in Yan'an, the communists refined their political and military strategies, emphasizing peasant mobilization and guerrilla warfare. They also began developing a more sophisticated ideological framework that combined Marxism-Leninism with Chinese characteristics, creating a uniquely Chinese form of communism that would prove more appealing to rural masses than orthodox Marxist doctrine. By 1945, Japan's defeat was imminent, and both Chinese factions rushed to prepare for renewed civil war. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by Soviet entry into the Pacific War, accelerated Japanese surrender beyond anyone's expectations. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's capitulation on August 15, 1945, it caught Chinese leaders off guard. Chiang Kai-shek ordered communist forces to remain in place, while his armies accepted Japanese surrenders and occupied major cities. However, communist forces, particularly in northern China, ignored these orders and raced to seize Japanese weapons and territory. The Soviets, who had occupied Manchuria, provided crucial assistance to communist forces while officially maintaining neutrality. American support flowed to the nationalists, including airlifting Chiang's forces to key cities. The stage was set for the final phase of the Chinese Civil War, with both sides better armed and more determined than ever. The brief moment of victory celebration quickly gave way to renewed preparation for fratricidal conflict. American General George Marshall arrived in China in December 1945 with a mission to mediate between the warring factions and prevent renewed civil war. For months, he shuttled between Nanjing and Yan'an, attempting to broker a political settlement that would create a coalition government. Both Mao and Chiang paid lip service to peace negotiations while secretly preparing for war. The Marshall Mission achieved temporary ceasefires and prisoner exchanges, raising hopes for lasting peace. However, fundamental disagreements about military command, territorial control, and political power proved insurmountable. Neither leader trusted the other enough to risk genuine compromise. Chiang believed his American-equipped armies could achieve quick victory, while Mao was confident that time favored the communists due to their superior popular support and guerrilla capabilities. By early 1947, it was clear that Marshall's mission had failed. Small-scale clashes escalated into major battles as both sides abandoned all pretense of seeking peaceful resolution. The final phase of China's civil war had begun. The renewed civil war began with apparent nationalist advantages. Chiang's armies controlled most major cities, had superior equipment provided by the Americans, and outnumbered communist forces significantly. The nationalists launched major offensives designed to crush communist base areas quickly before they could consolidate their wartime gains. In 1947, nationalist forces even captured Yan'an, the communist capital, forcing Mao to flee to remote caves in northern Shanxi. However, these early victories proved hollow. The communists had learned invaluable lessons during the war against Japan about mobile warfare and popular mobilization. They avoided decisive battles while constantly harassing nationalist supply lines and isolated garrisons. More importantly, they won peasant support through genuine land reform programs that redistributed wealth from landlords to farmers. Nationalist forces, meanwhile, struggled with corruption, low morale, and overextended supply lines. Their occupation of cities became a liability as they had to garrison numerous fixed positions while the communists moved freely through the countryside. The Battle of Lyaoshan in late 1948 marked the turning point of the Civil War. This massive campaign in Manchuria pitted the best nationalist armies against Lin Biao's communist forces in a decisive struggle for China's industrial heartland. The communists had grown stronger through recruitment and Soviet equipment transfers, while nationalist morale was cracking under the strain of endless garrison duties and guerrilla attacks. Over 47 days of fighting, communist forces systematically isolated and destroyed nationalist strongholds. The siege of Changchun lasted 5 months, with civilian casualties mounting as both sides fought for control. When the dust settled, the nationalists had lost over 470,000 troops, including some of Chiang's best divisions. This catastrophic defeat cost the nationalists all of Manchuria and its vital industrial base. More importantly, it demonstrated that communist forces could now win conventional battles against the best nationalist units. The psychological impact was devastating, as many began to sense which way the wind was blowing. Following their victory in Manchuria, communist forces launched the Huaihai campaign, an even larger battle that would seal the nationalist fate. This massive engagement lasted 65 days and involved over 1 million troops on both sides, making it one of the largest military operations in human history. The battle raged across the North China Plain between the Huai and Hai rivers, with both sides committing their strategic reserves. Communist forces, now renamed the People's Liberation Army, demonstrated remarkable tactical sophistication and coordination. They successfully encircled multiple nationalist armies and destroyed them piecemeal despite desperate relief efforts. The PLA's political warfare proved equally effective, with entire nationalist units surrendering or defecting rather than fighting to the death. Chiang's best American-equipped divisions were annihilated, while communist forces captured enormous quantities of military equipment. By January 1949, the nationalists had lost another 550,000 troops and any hope of defending the Yangtze River line. The road to Nanjing lay open. The Beiping-Tianjin campaign completed the communist conquest of northern China and demonstrated their growing political sophistication. Instead of costly assaults on these historic cities, PLA commanders negotiated surrenders that preserved cultural treasures and civilian lives. Fu Zoi, the nationalist commander defending Beijing, agreed to peaceful surrender in exchange for guarantees about his troops' treatment and the city's preservation. This marked a new phase in communist strategy, emphasizing political solutions over pure military force where possible. The capture of Beijing was particularly symbolic, as it had been China's capital for centuries and represented the mandate of heaven. Mao's forces now controlled most of China north of the Yangtze River, along with the country's most important industrial and agricultural regions. The nationalist government prepared to abandon Nanjing and retreat south of the Yangtze, hoping the Great River would provide a defensible line. However, few believed that this natural barrier could halt the communist advance for long. The endgame was approaching rapidly. In April 1949, the People's Liberation Army launched its final offensive by crossing the Yangtze River, China's great natural barrier. This massive operation involved over 1 million troops crossing the river on a 300-mile front, using everything from warships to fishing boats. The nationalists had hoped the Yangtze would provide time to reorganize and possibly negotiate a peace agreement that would partition China. However, their river defenses crumbled quickly under the weight of the communist assault. Within days, PLA forces had established multiple bridgeheads and were racing toward Nanjing and Shanghai. The speed and coordination of this river-crossing operation demonstrated how much the communist military had evolved since the desperate days of the Long March. Local populations welcomed the advancing troops, providing boats, guides, and supplies that facilitated the rapid advance. On April 23, 1949, communist forces entered Nanjing, the nationalist capital, effectively ending organized resistance in central China. The thousand-year-old dream of Chinese unification under communist rule was nearly complete. Shanghai, China's largest and most modern city, fell to communist forces on May 27, 1949, after minimal resistance. The rapid collapse of nationalist defenses in their former strongholds demonstrated how completely the military situation had reversed since 1947. Chiang Kai-shek and his remaining followers fled to the island of Taiwan, protected by the Taiwan Strait and American naval power. From there, they continued to claim legitimacy as the Republic of China and vowed to return to the mainland. However, their effective control was now limited to Taiwan, some coastal islands, and scattered garrisons that would soon surrender. The communist victory was essentially complete on the mainland, achieved through superior strategy, popular support, and the gradual erosion of nationalist will to fight. Millions of Chinese had died during 22 years of civil war, but the survivors now faced the prospect of national unification under communist rule. The stage was set for the proclamation of the People's Republic of China and the beginning of a new chapter in Chinese history. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop Tiananmen Gate and proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China to a crowd of hundreds of thousands. This moment marked the end of the Chinese Civil War and the beginning of communist rule over the world's most populous nation. The victory had been achieved through a combination of effective guerrilla warfare, superior political organization, genuine land reform that won peasant support, and strategic mistakes by the nationalist government. The cost was enormous: millions dead, cities destroyed, and a generation scarred by constant warfare. However, China was finally unified under a single government for the first time since the fall of the Qing dynasty. The communists now faced the challenge of rebuilding a war-torn nation and transforming their revolutionary movement into an effective government. Meanwhile, in Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China survived under American protection, ensuring that the Chinese Civil War would technically continue for decades as a frozen conflict across the Taiwan Strait. If you liked today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.